So, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Welcome to Heritage, a Risky Business, ? I'm Beverly Gormley, the Heritage Trust Network's Programme Manager, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by freelance project coordinator and network trustee, David Trevis-Smith, and Leah from Hayes Parsons Insurance Brokers, who are a very valued, long-standing supporter of the Heritage Trust Network. They're both going to be talking all things risk from an insurance and project management perspective, and I'm sure you're all going to find this session really helpful, especially given the current situation we find ourselves in with regards to the pandemic and its knock-on effect for our sector. I'll be in the background manning the chat box, and there'll be time for questions towards the end of the event after David and Ben have both spoken. So please do post your questions there. The usual Zoom etiquette applies, so please, can everybody stay on mute? And as this event's being recorded, please turn off your webcams if you don't want to be seen. The way they tend to be recorded is in speaker view, but there's the odd occasion where people's webcams pop up on the recording. So I'm just letting you know if you don't want to be seen. If you look in the top left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see we're using something called Otter AI. This is a live speech-to-text transcript service that makes our events more accessible for people with hearing impairments. So if you feel that you'd like to give that a try, just click on where it says live on Otter AI and a separate screen should pop up. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ben. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Bev, and thank you for all for joining us today to talk about, well, from my perspective anyway, insurance considerations for the works that you might be considering entertaining, are part way through, or perhaps are going through some bidding to get some funding, or indeed they could be at the latter part of the completion stages. I am going to share my screen. I've only got 3 or 4 slides, but there is quite a bit of content behind it all. So bear with me. Hopefully there will be some takeaway messages from what I'm about to say. Luckily, this is recorded, so feel free to obviously revisit it. And if there are any questions, just pop them into the chat box and we'll get round to them at the end after David has done his session. But I will just get my screen up to share. And I think to deliver this, I'll just hide myself because it is slightly easier. Okay, heritage projects, insurance considerations. What we're going to run through is the pre-build considerations, the actual build itself. How do we protect people? Who do we need to protect? Once we've got to the completed build, how do we arrive at the sum insured? What happens if the sum insured might be incorrect? And wrapping around all of this, and indeed looking forward, is actual risk management and resilience. You've done practical completion. The building is now being handed over to you for your own commercial purposes, or indeed you might have a third-party tenant in. How do you make sure that if something does happen, a fire or a flood, for example, you get on your feet as swiftly as possible? The pre-build considerations. So what are your responsibilities? As the property owner, you are responsible for ensuring that anyone contracted to carry out works on the property is competent to do so and will work in a safe manner whilst considering the safety of others. To protect yourself, you should be able to show that the trust has taken reasonable steps to ensure anyone appointed to carry out works has sufficient training, relevant skills, and are competent. So what are the actual things you need to consider before works commence? One is contractual obligations. And this is from an insurance perspective. Most construction contracts are subject to the JCT form of contract, which is the Joint Contracts Tribunal. Now within this, there are insurance clauses. To identify them, they're usually categorized A, B, and C. Now, these specify which party is responsible for insuring which parts of the project. The perils to be insured against, i.e. the causes of the loss, and who the insured party should be, i.e. who is actually named on the certificate of insurance. As a rule of thumb, Clause A means the contractor is responsible for ensuring the contract works, and the trust as employer has no responsibility until you actually get the keys upon practical completion. Although more likely you are going to be working on a partial existing property, in which case clause C would apply, and that would be a joint names policy between the trust and the actual principal contractor, which I'll come on to in a moment. We then need to consider the existing structures. It is cleaner to have the same insurer for the contract works and also that of the existing structure, because it removes any grey areas as to who is liable for what. The last thing you want is two insurers arguing with each other with the trust left in the middle, because at the end of the day, it is your financial liability. We must be mindful that some insurers may wish to provide restricted cover on the existing structure, i.e. it could just be fire and not much else, whereas the works could be on an all-risk basis, i.e. more expansive perils, malicious persons, flooding, etc. So you either need to ask the insurer to match the covers for the existing and the works, or take the existing structure away from the current policy and put it onto a contract works project policy, in which case you eradicate all of the grey areas that I have just said, because it will be one policy which will cover the existing structure and indeed all the associated works. We then need to think about the works and the materials. When undertaking renovation work, as I say, clause C would apply, and this means the trust would need to take out the works insurance in joint names with the contractor for the full contract value on a specified perils basis, as I've just mentioned. Also, being mindful of terrorism cover. This is often overlooked. JCT contracts default to include terrorism cover. Now, the JCT is a template. It is up to those in the contract to have a discussion and agree if you wish to take the clauses out. You might not want terrorism to be included. That's absolutely fine. You just need to make sure that it's removed from the contract. And indeed, if there is any bidding attached to the funding, would they be okay with no terrorism cover? Because it could be a contractual stipulation to include. Covenants, searches. You need to consider what searches need to be done, because these could be limited in nature, or they could simply be much trickier than, say, the ones that you would do when purchasing a house. Access and ownership rights need to be considered, amongst others. Restrictive covenants are a cheap way to protect the trust should a part in the future lay claim to access or ownership, which could then result in the build or future trade of the building be in jeopardy. We often find that because of the nature of the land that we're dealing with, it's actually difficult to ascertain who is responsible for what and who owns what. And if that vested interested party comes out in the future and challenges you, then they could basically kibosh the whole works, but having indemnity insurance in place will negate that financial exposure. Appointing a contractor. Reasonable checks should be carried out prior to any appointment. Checks should focus on a contractor's competency and experience, especially when working with unique heritage property. For major works, including the use of heat, equipment, then further checks may be considered, including obtaining references or testimonials. CDM regulations. The Construction Design and Management Regulations applies to all works undertaken in the UK. They basically set out who does what and who is responsible. As a building preservation trust arranging construction, you are considered the client for the purposes of CDM regulations. Your duties will include allowing sufficient time and resource for each stage of the project, ensuring the competence of all appointees, ensuring there are suitable arrangements for managing the project, and provision of information to designers and contractors prior to construction work beginning. You may wish to delegate this to a competent person to discharge these duties. That is acceptable under the regulations. So once we've cleared that hurdle, we jump into the build itself. So what do these phrases actually mean? Contract words. So this actually ensures the works in progress and the fixed and unfixed materials that include all of the costs, including professional fees and VAT, where this is not reclaimable. usually insured for the fixed contract sum with a percentage escalator to take into account any unforeseen costs, which I'll touch upon shortly. You should also note the cover period. Our recommendation would be to boost the end date by a couple of months against what is perceived to be the current end date as by the contract. There will be overruns, and you don't really want to be asking for extended cover when you can provide that buffer in at the outset, and it would cost you no more in premium. Non-negligence, often referred to as 651. This is where a third party could sue the employer, the trust, or the contractor for damage to their property as a result of the works undertaken. If such damage was caused by a contractor due to their negligence, then their public liability insurance would kick in. Or if it is a design defect, their or their consultant's professional indemnity insurance would kick in. But if there was damage to the third party as a result of subsidence, vibrations, or weakening of support, whereby there was no negligence, the insurance just mentioned would not respond, and they could try and sue the trust as a key employer to the contract. This is more relevant if dealing with adjoining properties. You can protect yourselves by having party wall agreements and condition surveys. And another key point is keep the neighbours on side when you're actually dealing with works, because they can become a headache. An often overlooked aspect is delayed startup cover, but it should be a consideration. Ask yourself a question. What is the future use of the building? If you have a tenant lined up and there is a fire just before the end of the build, you would lose the income from that tenant. Likewise, if it's within your financial projections to be used for your own commercial purposes. The buildings would be put back up again under the building section, and the works, ditto, under the contract works insurance. But this delay and consequential loss would not be insured without this additional delayed startup cover. Conditions on any insurance policy should have key attention. If you do not adhere to a policy condition, and that results in being attributable to the loss, the insurers will simply walk away, and you will have no argument or rights of recourse with them because you would have breached your policy obligation. I've highlighted 3 here, which I think are pertinent. One is hot works. Many aspects of building works can include the use of heat, such as welding equipment, heat guns, cutting torches. And most insurers will have a condition within their wording that requires hot work permit systems to be in operation. This tracks back to the operation of CDM regs. Who is responsible for what? And this system ensures that permission is obtained from an appropriate person before starting work that involves the application of heat. There are certain procedures and precautions which, if implemented before, during, and after the works take place, as long as you adhere to those and there is a subsequent fire, the insurer will be liable to meet the loss. Unoccupied premises. Vacant properties cause a greater risk in respect of malicious damage, arson, theft, and especially burst pipes in the winter seasons. Routine maintenance can be overlooked, resulting in blocked gutters or missing tiles, and lead to subsequent water ingress. These should be key considerations once you've finished the build. You need to have dialogue with the insurer or your broker should there be a delay from the completion of the works until it's actually occupied. Insurers may want to restrict the cover, but if you've got suitable precautions in place, then you should be able to negotiate with your insurer or your broker on your behalf to get the full cover, because you don't want to be spending X £100,000 or £1 million just to only have limited cover at the end of the day for the sake of a few months until you're actually up to full trading. But you can mitigate the chance of something going wrong, disconnecting the services, making sure access points are sealed, letterboxes, for example, making sure there's no flammable or combustible material anywhere in the premises, and do inspections. Keep logs of the inspections. Documentation is key to prove that the inspections have been undertaken. The final one is subcontractors. We mentioned there may be a joint name policy, so therefore the choice of contractor is important. You may find insurers pay additional attention to assessing the credibility and experience against the contractors, because if they're not credible or experienced, that heightens the chances of potentially shoddy workmanship, and therefore their approach and culture to risk management might differ from the more credible organisations. You should check the contractor's limits of insurance, public liability in the main, and professional indemnity where relevant for design defects. You need to assess what could go wrong. Are the limits suitable? Do they have any clauses on the policy or exclusions which are red flags? For example, if they're doing heat works and they have a heat work exclusion under your policy, which is common, again, you would be on a sticky wicket there to comply with this clause, and you may find yourself in an argument with the insurance company to meet that particular loss. People. We wish to protect people, so I thought it might be helpful to bring to life what these phrases actually mean. I'm going to speak most about the trustee's indemnity, but to reaffirm what the other two refer to. So employer's liability, this protects the trust for breaches of duty of care owed to employees, including volunteers or other persons who are working under the supervision of the trust, which may result in death or injury. Public and property owners' liability. Public liability covers your legal liability for negligence to anyone who is not defined as an employee. This could be death, injury, or property damage. Property owner's liability covers your legal liability for negligence, which results in death or injury to another person. But this time, it's not necessarily your activities that would cause the incident. It could be the property itself or the land that you're legally liable for. A roof slate falling off, hitting somebody, or somebody falling over in a pothole. Interesting to note, because of the Occupiers Liability Act, that person who falls over in a pothole could be a trespasser. You could still be legally liable. Trustees' indemnity. Why should you have this cover? As a member of the Board of Trustees, you are ultimately responsible for the affairs of the charity and for delivering the outcomes that it was intended to create. Although the majority of trustees are volunteers, there is still a certain amount of risk involved in holding one of these positions. Even when acting in good faith, you could be held personally liable for your business decisions, a bit like a director is in a limited liability company. So what do we mean by personal liability? Depending on the circumstances, such as the legal structure of the charity and the charity's governing document, trustees may be held personally liable for any debts or losses the charity incurs. If the trustee acts prudently, lawfully, and in accordance with the governing document, any liabilities, including debts or financial obligations, can normally be met by the charity's resources. However, if these are exhausted, they could be tapped, the trustees could be tapped up for it. Even if a trustee acts imprudently or is in breach of the law, he or she may be held personally responsible for any liabilities the charity incurs as a result, because trustees act collectively. Once you become a trustee, you will have additional certain duties and be required to follow relevant legislation. And the general duties are duty of care, duty of prudence, and duty to comply. But how do you protect yourself against all of these? The natural answer, because I'm here, is of course insurance. Now, insurance to protect trustees is very cost effective. What it will do is it will pay to protect you for any claims for breach of these duties just mentioned. You may be no merit in the claims, they may be spurious, they could even be vexatious, but you could still end up with a big legal bill to try and protect you and defend you going through court. This could also include investigations through the Health and Safety Executive if, for example, there was a serious injury to an employee or a member of the public, and the HSE think that the individual trustees responsible for H&S have paid scant regard, and that could need to be defended. So we've gone through all of this, we protected the employees, we've done the build, we're at the end of completion. How do we arrive at the sum insured? Three things here. How do you get it right? What happens if you get it wrong? And what on earth does declared value actually mean on insurance policies? Getting it right. At the center of most trusts, there is a building that requires protection. Protection from neglect, from the elements, and from the unforeseen events such as your fires and your floods. One of the fundamental factors in obtaining adequate insurance is understanding the true cost of reinstating your heritage property. Heritage properties tend to be more expensive to rebuild in comparison to contemporary structures. If this was not the case, then the then the need for the trust may not be as great as they actually are at the moment. I'm going to come into the declared value because Brexit and the pandemic is causing a bit of strife at the moment. But what happens if you get it wrong? Most insurance policies will include a condition which is commonly referred to as the condition of average or the average clause. This condition ultimately means that if you insure the building for less than the amount it would cost for full reinstatement, and full reinstatement is key here, then any claim payment can be reduced by the same proportion as the underinsurance. As an example, let's assume that the cost to renovate is 2 million, but it's only insured for 1 million. There is then a fire and it only partially damages the property. Even though it's only a partial loss, the loss adjuster, who is employed by the insurer to go and validate the loss, could then say, well, okay, the loss is 100,000, but actually we think to rebuild the whole thing is 2 million. We are then going to cut your claim in half, so that 100,000 turns into 50,000. The trust is left to foot the bill for that shortfall. And again, that decision making could find its way up to the trustees because you have allowed the insurance to be placed on the incorrect value, potentially. So going to the value again, the declared value. The declared value provided to the insurer should represent the full cost of reinstating it where it is completely destroyed. The figure should include the cost to comply with relevant legislation and allow for the use of building materials of a similar quality, design and style to be replicated. Other factors that are commonly overlooked include site clearance, removal of debris, and indeed professional fees, because the site will need to be cleared, made safe, and then the works can commence, and architects, surveyors, and other professions would need to be engaged in that overall sum insured. VAT also needs to be insured if it cannot be reclaimed. Also, which is often overlooked, is in respect of coming to this sum insured, think about your old outbuildings, think about perimeter fencing and walls and internal fixtures and fittings. There's something called day one inflation. This basically means you have a sum insured when the policy is put together, which is uplifted automatically by say 15% or so to account for any considerations which are unforeseen at point of claim. Let's just say construction inflation, which I'm going to touch upon now because construction inflation is known, but it's going rampant off the back of Brexit and the pandemic. So this is partly because of a shortage of raw materials and labour, because there is a shortage of skilled labour and indeed manual labour, because those that did it because of Brexit implications are in shorter supply, and that's driving up cost. To put this into percentage terms, property indexation, i.e. the approximate value of rebuild costs, usually increase per annum at about 2 or 3%. It's currently running at 7%, i.e. now would cost 7% more to put the building up than it would this time last year. But that is for run-of-the-mill buildings with standard materials. Heritage is not run-of-the-mill. You can turn that 7% into a double-digit percentage. And RICS believe this figure is going to go much higher before it comes back down again. But the jury's out on timescales on that. So the final topic I'm going to touch upon is risk management and resilience. So one of the overriding objectives of the Preservation Trust will be restore and preserve the heritage asset. You may need funding to do this. Risk management and resilience will be a key aspect of your actual bid. So what's the whole approach? What's the concept for risk management? It's simply to identify anything that could prevent your organization from achieving its stated aims, agreeing a process to monitor and manage such risks, and transferring risks that the charity does not wish to carry over to an insurer. 3 stages in brief: assessment, mitigation and management, and then transfer. And on your screen now, to assist further, that can be subcategorized into people, property and assets, reputation, and business continuity. If you have these as 4 key pillars, if you like, in respect of your approach to risk management, And there are sub-questions that sit behind all of these categories that should form part of your resiliency and business continuity plan. And if there is a serious incident, you are much more likely to survive because you will know which levers to pull to mitigate the downtime. And as the final slide here, as a bit of assistance, now we will ask HTN to send a version of this round to everybody in their membership. But there's a version of this for the 4 categories. The idea is you self-score yourself. So there's a set question list on the left, and you self-score yourself to see whether you do have procedures and plans in place to mitigate the impact of the actual question. If your answer is yes, it's a 3. If the answer is simply you don't, it's a 1. So what you do is you tot up all of your scores, and you can see in the comments section, you get the aggregation of the scores depending on where it is. So if you've got 1 to 10, that basically means you've got some areas of identified weakness, and there are some suggestions here in how to remedy those weaknesses. If you're in the middle, you might have a bit of both in respect of some areas you've got good policies and procedures, some areas are identified. And if you're in the top one, 21 to 30, then that suggests you've got a good grasp of your exposures and the risks and how you manage them. And it's really a case of keeping abreast of developments to maintain those policies and procedures. But as I say, there's a version of that approach, if you like, replicated for all aspects of the actual resiliency roadmap. And the idea is, naturally, we would like you to speak to us because we can talk about all of these things with you and work with the insurers to provide templates, to put procedures in place. What I would say finally from the insurance perspective is insurers, there is a lot more to insurance than just paying the claim. They've got a lot of guidance notes, there's a lot of templates that they can help you actually provide you with the resources to actually put your plans together. They can get you a 7 or an 8 out of 10 continuity plan with a little bit of input from you guys relatively swiftly. You don't have to find this information yourself. And that brings me to a conclusion.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was fantastic. There's so much information in that presentation. I'm really glad we've recorded it. And hopefully everybody else is thinking the same. It will be upon our website in the next few days. So if you did miss anything or you want to hear it back again, it will be on the website. So don't worry about it. And thank you for saying that you'll share the resilience roadmap with us as well. We'll put that on Toolkit. That would be great. But thank you, Ben. We'll take questions at the end after David's presentation. So moving swiftly on, I will introduce David Trevis-Smith.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And I will now do my screen share. He said, hopefully. Press the right buttons. Bear with me. Okay, hopefully you now can see my screen.
We can.
Good, thank you. So yes, I'm David Trevis-Smith and very pleased to be with you. And yes, that is a roof truss being supported by conduit that is holding up a fluorescent light fitting. So yes, we have a few risks to deal with, don't we, from time to time. So my journey into heritage rescue. When I was 5, I was admitted to hospital with pneumonia. And it was actually the 3rd time I've been to hospital. So the first time I was admitted suffering with bronchiolitis. The second time I went to hospital, I was suffering with the measles combined with encephalitis, which is inflammation of brain tissue. So all 3 quite scary episodes. My sister was suffering similar visits to hospital. So a bit of a challenging time, and our family doctor, Dr. Benson, thought that a contributory factor to this may well be the air that we were breathing, because I was brought up in the heart of the industrial West Midlands, lived in terraced housing, and dotted in between the terraced houses were iron foundries and drop hammer forges and all sorts of heavy metal working. So Dr. Benson, in his infinite wisdom, suggested to my parents that the best thing to do would be to get some more fresh air. And it just so happened that a local farmer, Albert was his name, used to deliver eggs on a weekly basis. Different times, isn't it really? Weekly egg delivery from the local farmer. And he had a boat on the local canal. So he suggested that that my parents could borrow his boat and get us out into the fresh air onto the canal. And that started, my parents then bought a boat, and then we spent every weekend of my childhood and every holiday of my childhood boating on canals. And that really involved getting involved with campaigning to save canals, because they were at risk of being closed, filled in, turned into roads, whatever. So campaigning, that got into the blood. And then, of course, there are buildings alongside canals. So we got involved with campaigning to save buildings, and that expanded to campaigning to save historic buildings wherever they may be. And that resulted in the job I do now. So I have a lot to thank Dr. Benson for. I have a lot to thank the NHS for prolonging my life, without a doubt. But Dr. Benson's identification and recommendation as to what might be the mitigating action introduced me to what turned out to be my career. So an interesting start to my life. But what might Dr. Benson have done? I'm hoping that this will move on. He may well have thought through this sort of process. He may well have said, okay, well, what's the risk here? I think that the local air quality is causing poor health. What's the likelihood of that happening? I think it's a pretty high likelihood because of the location. What's the likely impact? I think it's pretty high. I'm seeing evidence of that through these children. And therefore, if I multiply those together, what's my overall risk rating, in my opinion? High. The key thing that he did was he took that on the stage, didn't he, and said, okay, well, what action could be taken here? Spend more time in the countryside. The likelihood of that risk doesn't change because the air quality wasn't changing. Where we lived didn't change, but the impact just might change. 2 days out of 7, we might be in fresh country air rather than in the town. So overall, perhaps that mitigated overall risk rating might come down to medium. And I'm sure it did. And I'm sure it got even lower than that. There are other things that happened in the meantime, but I'm still around to talk about it. And in very good health, I'm pleased to say. So the focus of my presentation are project risks. Ben has just talked about overall organisational risks, of which projects form one part. But my experience is very much as a project organiser. So I'm talking about project risks. And the sort of overall risk assessment of the organisation is what Ben was just touching on at the end of his presentation very usefully. But that's not my subject. My subject is specifically projects. And this is what I'm going to cover. So who should consider project risks? What are they? And maybe share an example with you. When would we consider risks and how do we monitor them? And then if we've got time, I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, a few more examples before then we go into the Q&A session. So who should consider project risks? Well, I've been involved in a few organisations that I would perhaps characterise with this diagram. And certainly if your project is being run by that, then we need to worry, don't we? But the key thing is so often it seems to be that risk assessment, risk registers, that's something that somebody else does, or maybe a member of the team does, but it's certainly not joined up. And we might have these poor risk assessors at the bottom of the boat there, recognising the risks and bailing out as quickly as they can. And the rest of the team are merrily going on with the project, not realising that we're about to sink. So who should consider project risks? Well, in my opinion, from my experience, it has to be a team approach, and the team is critical here. Ben talked about the competence of the team that need to be involved, and that competent team are the people that need to be involved in assessing the risks. So in my experience with building conservation projects, that's people like the conservation architect, the quantity surveyor, the structural engineer, but then also representatives of the trustees, whoever's on that project team. And the reason I suggest a team approach is because it's useful for everyone to be up to speed on risks, but it's also useful to have different perspectives and different thoughts on risks to reach a consensus. And this is very much an integral part of every project. It's not an add-on. So, what are the project risks? Well, how long's a piece of string? Let's think about the stages of projects first of all. I know there are people who say, well, the easiest way to avoid risks is to do nothing. And that is very true. A general life statement, isn't it? But in our case, where we're looking to rescue heritage at risk, that's not an option, is it? Because the clue is in the title. We're starting with heritage at risk. We've got a risk to begin with, and if we do nothing, that risk is only going to increase, not decrease. So that first stage doesn't really exist, does it? Apart from that's where you're at when you're just starting a project. But then we can perhaps break the project down into the development phase, the delivery phase, the operational phase when we finish the construction works, and perhaps separate to that, a separate thought about public events, which could be at any of those stages, but they are very specific risk assessment that is needed for a public event. The types of risks to consider, and what I'm saying here is that these are areas of risk to consider. I've seen risk registers written where they're all broken down into different headings, generally these headings, or perhaps a few less than this. But I struggle with that, because if you try and break the actual register down into these headings, then you end up having arguments in the team as to, well, I don't think it's a legal risk, I think that's a financial risk. Well, actually, that's irrelevant. It's a risk to the project. So I'll put this list forward just as a prompt, really, for the team to think about all the different types of risk that we might want to consider. But in terms of listing them, they're all one list. They're all just risks. I'm not going to go through them all in detail because that would be boring. It would be death by PowerPoint to read what's on the slide. These will be available afterwards, so you can read through them at your leisure. And I don't claim that this is an exhaustive list in terms of the examples against each heading. I think the headings are pretty good, but I would say that, wouldn't I? But the examples, I'm sure you can think of more. They're intended as prompts to prompt that thought process. So let's think about an example, shall we? And before I go any further, before I get into trouble with funders, let me say that all of the example projects I'm talking about, the key funders were Architectural Heritage Fund in the early stages, God bless them, and the Heritage Fund. There are lots of other funders, but they're different for each project. So for those, I need to refer you to the websites. So Cromford Mills in Derbyshire, a site operated by the Arkwright Society. And the subject of this project that I was the project organizer for was Building 17, which is the one in the distance there, the 5-storey mill building. And there's a schematic of the site. If you can see my cursor, that photograph was taken from the entrance here, looking up the yard, and then Building 17 is here. And that's it from the street view, a very imposing building. We had a few clues when it comes to risks. We already knew that building had been used in its most recent life for paint manufacture. And this document we found when tidying up in the building. It's not a very good scan, but it is actually a recipe. It's a recipe for mixing paint. And it includes on the list of ingredients arsenic, lead, chromium, and just about every poison known to humankind, I think. So we knew we'd got a bit of a challenge. It wasn't news to us because we'd already been warned of this from its previous use. But obviously, once you come to start doing a project, you have to consider this as a high risk. It very much was a high risk. The way we tackled that was to carry out some investigation, site investigation. So the lady in the two photographs at the bottom of the page there is from University of Lincoln, carrying out some assessments of the fabric of the building to assess what contaminants might still be there lurking in the timber and indeed in the stone. And then up above those tinted areas were experiments we then conducted to say, okay, well, now we've identified what contaminants are here, how might we go about treating them and removing them? So we tried different methods because it hadn't been done before, believe it or not. Well, certainly we couldn't find anywhere that had dealt with these sort of contaminants apart from demolition. That was the usual solution. But we're talking here about a grade 1 listed building in a World Heritage Site where demolition wasn't really a solution. Mothballing would have been the other solution, but that just increases the risk to the trust because they've got a building with no income generation. And sooner or later, someone has to do something about it. And we decided that we were the generation with the support of our funders who might actually get on and do something about it. But it was a real game. All of the work had to be done in a airtight situation. We had to have airlocks in between the sections in the building. Everyone had to be fully suited up in full PPE, including a face mask. Each person had to have their face measured and then a mask made to fit their face so that there was absolutely no possibility of air getting in. They had to be tested, blood tests every week, monitored throughout to make sure that there was no contamination getting into the bloodstream and a full decontamination unit outside. So every time they left the building, they had to go through decontamination, even to go to the loo, showered, dressed, go to the loo, come back, get back into your PPE. So it added a lot to the costs. We were anticipating all that because we'd done the risk assessment and we knew, well, we did the evaluation and it was all taken into account. However, there are still things that come to surprise you. So on the bottom right, I think that's the archaeologists doing the watching brief for the archaeology. But we had a problem. That's the second team of archaeologists, because the first team of archaeologists arrived on site, having gone through all the procurement process, and they started day one. And we said, oh, you need to come and measure up now for your face mask then. And they said, face mask? Yes, you'll need to shave. Shave? Because, of course, they all had beards. And the last thing they were going to do was shave their beards. So we lost our team of archaeologists and we had to re-procure. So unanticipated events. You can never cover everything in a risk register. And talking about things that you can't necessarily cover in a risk register, but this one perhaps you can, and that is to think about the risks of success. I think we have a natural tendency, don't we, to think about the risks of failure, but actually there are also risks of being too successful. So another Arkwright Society project was this one, Lumsdale Valley, which is a fantastic place. It's a beautiful valley, a hidden gem. I think is a regular phrase, is it not? And this certainly applied to the Lumsdale Valley. A hidden gem, beautiful valley, well worth a visit. Come and explore the valley and join in. We were so successful with this project that everyone did exactly that. And the hidden gem was no longer a hidden gem. And we had all sorts of problems of just too many people. So when should we consider risks? Well, we all know the answer to this, don't we? Is your to-do list, write the risk register, because we've got to put it into the grant application form. We must have a risk register. Okay, right, yes, write the risk register, put it in the form. Here's the register. What do we do with it now? Ah, yes, well, we'll file it. We'll file it because we've done that. We've ticked that. No. No. You may have gathered I'm a strong advocate of risk registers and risk assessments, and I think they are fundamental to the project, but they aren't a one-off. They are the basis of the project throughout, and they need regularly referring to. So project meetings, every project meeting should refer to the risk register, in my humble opinion. And then when it comes to updating it on grant progress forms, there's no hardship because you've already done it. It's a living, breathing document. Some people suggest, well, why can't we set up a separate subcommittee to deal with the risk register, rather than cluttering up our project meetings dealing with the risk register? It's so boring going through the risk register. No, because that's going exactly against the grain that I set out at the start, which is it's integral to the project, and everyone in the team has an input to make into that risk register. So how do we monitor risks? I've mentioned it lots of times, haven't I? Risk register. So if we go back to dear old Dr. Benson, this was my example from earlier. That's not necessarily covering everything we want to cover in a risk register. Now, I've had to deal with risk registers that are really, really complicated and take an age to fill in. And to my mind, that's not conducive to what you want. You want something that's simple, straightforward, everybody understands it, and everyone is encouraged, therefore, to regularly use it. But what dear old Dr. Benson has put here is perhaps a little bit too thin. So my suggestion, and there is no hard and fast rule on this, you can come up with your own design, and lots of people do, and you may want different headings, but from my experience, this is where I've arrived at. And it's a model that works for me. It's a little bit more detailed, but not overly complex. So we had a reference number, so everyone knows what risk we're referring to. The risk is as described before. The mitigation action is as before, but now we've got a target date. When are we actually going to do this? We need some action on it. Who's going to lead? Who's going to be responsible for dealing with this risk? Well, in this case, it was my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Trevis-Smith. And then what's the likelihood after mitigation? What's the impact after mitigation? And what's the overall risk? So I've not included on here the initial assessment, that initial likelihood, impact and overall risk rating. I've not shown here because to my mind, it's irrelevant. We've identified a risk and we need to focus on the mitigating action. We don't need to focus, every time we look at this risk register, we don't need to focus back to what was the risk before we took any mitigating action, because we're doing it. And the focus should be moving forward and what's next, rather than what's happened. That's obviously a very simplified example, but hopefully useful for the purpose of understanding really what I'm talking about. Okay, so we have got time. We can look at a few more examples. Back to the photograph I showed you in the first place. And this one is at Wentworth Woodhouse. So Wentworth Woodhouse, for those of you who don't know it, is in Rotherham in South Yorkshire. It's where I'm spending an awful lot of my time at the moment. It's a fantastic mansion. And it really is splendid. So this is the pillared hall on the entrance. Here's the marble saloon, which you may recognize from some films. Darkest Hour, I think, was on TV last week, wasn't it? And this was used for filming part of Darkest Hour with Churchill. It's also used for Gentleman Jack, but you wouldn't recognize it. And the Whistle Jacket stateroom, just one of many staterooms. And if you've not been to Wentworth Woodhouse, naturally, you would expect me to encourage you to do so. It is now open after the lockdown, I'm pleased to say, and the trust is desperate for income. Surprise, surprise. But you don't need to go many feet, really, from those wonderful staterooms. This is still on the same east facade, that main east facade of the building. And you can see the rot that has set in. So, I mean, this one poor window has just given up the ghost altogether, hasn't it, really? And here's another truss end that's rotted off. There are many, but this one was a particularly severe one. We tried to prop it. You can see the prop there in the window frame, that we tried to prop it against the sill. But continuing the risk assessment, it was continuing to move. So unfortunately, the only solution was a scaffold prop right from the ground, right through the middle floor and up under the truss. Not what anyone would want to do. What we want to do really is to carry out a full repair and restoration. But of course, that needs money. And if you wait for money, then in the meantime, the building's collapsed. So you have to take mitigating action from time to time. And that was the solution there. And it stopped it moving. It's given that building a few years grace whilst we are on the fundraising trail. I'm still at Wentworth Woodhouse. So roof slates, that one in a particularly bad condition. And the problem when the roof gets into that state, well, even before then, of course, is water ingress, as Ben was mentioning earlier, and the damage that water causes, but also pigeons and bats and all sorts of things that you really don't want to happen. Put them on the risk register, and we might decide what to do as mitigating action. On the right-hand side, lots of debris. This is a real tipping ground in some parts of the house and the stables. The trouble is that some of that debris has got asbestos in it. So it isn't just a case of, oh, let's hire a skip and cart it away. You've got a risk to deal with, which is the asbestos. And on the subject of asbestos, here's the cellars. And the Wentworth Woodhouse was used by a local college, a ladies' PE college in the 1950s, 60s. Asbestos was very popular at that time. So when they were refitting the house, they use asbestos everywhere, basically, and particularly on the heating systems. So the cellars are full of asbestos-containing materials. Put it on the risk register. What are the mitigating actions for dealing with asbestos? Well, our asbestos consultant said it's dangerous. So the only thing you can do until you've got the money to actually remove it is board it up. Don't let anyone in. It's dangerous. Okay, fine. But when you board up cellars, and particularly cellars where you've had holes in the roof and it's getting wet, that's beautiful for dry rot. And that's what you got in the photograph on the left-hand side. It's a monster, isn't it? And we got some amazing growths of wet and dry rot because we can't get any air circulation. We can't get air circulation because we've had to board it up because of the asbestos. You then add bats into the mix. Well, where do you go, really? Which action do you take first? And if you really want to know, I can tell you that bats take precedence over the whole lot. So the fact that you've got asbestos, I'm talking about the roofs now, you've got asbestos in the roof, and you've got holes in the roof. If you've got bats in there, you can't do anything about it until they're ready for you to take some action. So,
got 5 minutes, David.
I've actually come to the end because Q&A was the next. My clock's a little bit fast in that case, Bev. I was just going up to up to 30 minutes. There you go. That concludes my quick ramble through risk registers and risk assessment. I shall now try and stop sharing.
That was brilliant. Some amazing pictures you've got there. And oh, that building 17. I remember we were filming there last year. I shared a picture in the chat box, but just reading about it and seeing the different colours in the wall on the outside, you can see, oh, I don't know how you dealt with that. It must have been a real nightmare, a few sleepless nights, I think.
Yes, it's interesting because we were monitoring the health of the people working in that building throughout. We had an 18-month program of encapsulation, cleaning, encapsulation, and preparing for the fit out. And the team overall, I think they lost about 17 stone in weight. So it's a fantastic dieting process. A bit extreme, perhaps, not one that we could necessarily market, but I mean, it was horrendous conditions to work in. You're fully kitted in PPE in all weathers. So in the summer, particularly, it was getting quite warm in there, and you're hot in your PPE. And yeah, it's I take my hats off to them really for sticking at it and what they did.
Yeah,
and from a design point of view, it was a real challenge as well, because and I have to give credit here to Purcell Architects, who came up with all the goods here. Normally, you would do your initial cleaning and preparation and repairing the roof and so on, and then you'd gradually do your fit out. What we had to do with Building 17 was work out all the detailed fit out, where the electric sockets were going to go, where all the plumbing was going to go, where cuts were going to go for the staircase and doors. Every single bit of work to the fabric had to be done during that initial clean phase, because the building was then encapsulated. So once it was cleaned, it was then encapsulated. So if there's any risk of any residual contamination, it is encapsulated in the fabric. And all that had to be done before we could finish that first phase of work. So design-wise, it was all out of kilter. You were doing things at the wrong time. And the fact that it then all worked and it came together in the end was pretty amazing.
Yeah, well done to everybody involved in that. It's a fantastic place to visit. If anyone here hasn't been, do go and visit it. We've got some questions, a couple of questions that have been posted in the chat box. We've also got some questions that were sent in beforehand. So if anybody has got a burning question for Ben or David, do post it in the chat box or use the reactions button that you find at the bottom of your screen and put your hand up if you want to speak. But I'll gradually start going through the questions, so please do shout out if I missed anything. The first question we had was from Nick Lindsay, and he said, who values the rebuild cost for the declared value, and how reliable is the valuation, i.e. is there any comeback if undervalued? I think that's for Ben.
There's a couple of answers to that. So we're dealing with heritage here, which rules a lot of the more familiar names out in the insurance industry, shall we say. But I'll give a shout out to Ecclesiastical Insurance for this particular answer, because for part of their proposition, because they deal with a lot of churches, a lot of grade 1, grade A, depending on where we are in the country, and independent schools, they understand the quirkiness, the raw materials, the time scales, etc. And indeed, there was an incident whereby, because there was a particular stone used and they couldn't find it anywhere, they had to reopen a quarry to get the stone. Now that's not normal, don't get me wrong, and that can't be factored into the actual rebuild cost. But in respect of how you do it, they actually, as part of their proposition, will value it for you. So as long as you go with their recommendation, then the risk is on them in respect of it being underinsured, i.e. you're not underinsured. That's not to say that if it costs 20 million and they say it's worth 10 million, they will actually, the limit of liability will remain at 10 million, but you won't be underinsured. If there's a loss of 5 million, for argument's sake, you would get 5 million. So that example I gave is irrelevant, it wouldn't apply. The other bet is going through a RICS valuation that actually signs off the sum insured and said, in their professional opinion, it costs X amount to do. Choose wisely in respect of their credentials, because we're not dealing with modern methods of construction. We're not dealing with brick block here. We need somebody who actually understands what they're valuing. And rights of remedy, if they get it wrong, you're paying them for a professional service, you can sue them, to put it bluntly, and their professional indemnity insurance would kick in.
Brilliant, thanks Ben. I hope that answered your question, Nick. Again, this has been recorded, so if you need to go over anything again, we'll have the recording on the website. There's a nice simple question here, I think, for David. How do you make your risk register sexy and get people to pay attention to it?
Yeah, okay, it's a good one. The immediate thought comes to mind, KISS. For those who don't know what KISS stands for, it's keep it simple, stupid. At least I think that's where it started out in life. It was a Navy expression, I think. It's been sanitized since. I think it also has been used to stand for keep it simple and straightforward. But yes, KISS, there you are. There's a nice link. No, but aside from that, well, you can do all sorts of things, can't you? You can use colour in your risk register. So you can put greens and reds, whether it's low risk or a high risk. You can use upwards and downwards arrows to show whether the risk is increasing or decreasing. That's always a nice one. And actually one that I do find very useful is to colour code changes. So to save people having to reread the whole risk register every time, if you just colour code what's changed from the last version, that helps. It makes it quicker and easier for people to read. Whether that's sexy or not, not so sure, but
it helps though. Yeah. I'm going to keep that in mind. Colour coding the changes. That is a really good one. I'm going to use. Thank you for that.
Okay.
We've got one for Ben. This might be throwing the cat amongst the pigeons, actually. The question is, are there any insurances on offer that are not worth it? For example, trustees insurance given limited liability. What's the actual risk of trustees being made personally liable? I know you did touch on this.
Yeah, so we've got to think about, you've only got a set amount of money, so you have to consider what are you going to insure against? What is your approach to risk and self-insurance and transferring of risk? That's a starting point, really. And what you insure for will change as you go through the build, I would say, because at the moment, you know, you could be left with a wreck to begin with, to be honest with you, and all you're insuring is property owner's liability until the funding comes through. So that's not going to cost very much. Then you go into, well, okay, the money's come through from Heritage Lottery, for argument's sake, and various fundraising. It becomes meaningful. You're then on the hook for spending that money. So the trustees are in the hot seat on that. So if they mismanage that project or spend the money unwisely, they could be held personally accountable. And relatively, trustees indemnity is cheap to insure against, even though costs are going up at the moment because people are being sued left, right and centre off the back of mismanagement because of the pandemic. It's still relatively cheap, and the charitable sector is, yes, there's some claims going through, but it's still relatively well run because you've got decent people who are on the board of trustees who are competent and have experience in all walks of life. In respect of what is not worth it, obviously that's a subjective answer, so I can't say what is not worth it. But I would say is, when you speak to your broker about risk, if they come and say you need this, this and this, I'd probably question whether that's the right broker, because they don't understand you or your approach to risk or what you're trying to insure against or what you're trying to achieve over the medium to longer term. It's understanding what you're trying to achieve and say, well, these are your options, these are your considerations, and these are different ways to insure different things, because you can't just say risk A, for example. There could be various facets of insuring risk A, and that needs to be explained to you, and then you get to the solution.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. We've got a question that might be for both of you. It's many groups are working with buildings in poor condition that they want to share with the public. What steps can they take to bring people on site but not put anyone in danger? And if you clearly warn people of a risk, can you still be liable?
Do you want to go first, David?
I was muted, I think intentionally. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? And I am going to defer to Ben to talk about the insurance cover aspect. But in terms of making it safe, I think I mentioned in my presentation that public events are a special case all of their own, and you have to be very careful. It isn't something that I would want to see just covered in an overall project risk register. There needs to be a separate risk assessment for each event, because things will change, particularly during the course of a project. The nature of risks of having public attend site will change. So it needs to be a specific assessment at the time, and then there needs to be a separate method statement prepared on the back of the risk assessment to make sure that you've got cover for how you're organising that event. And also you need to be brave that if your risk assessment concludes that we just can't make this building safe, or not sufficient to a sufficient level, then you need to say, I'm sorry, we can't allow this to happen. So you need to be confident that you are able to make the building safe. There are risks wherever you go. I mean, you know, we talk about our buildings. I always smile because with Cromford Mills Building 17, the building is regularly monitored. Every 12 months, there's an ongoing arrangement that the building will be monitored for safety, for contamination, to make sure there is no residual contamination. It always comes back negative. And people say, oh, you know, I'm not so sure. You know, are we safe? Should we go to this? Should we get an office? Because it's the upper floors are offices. Should we use this building for offices? And I say, well, how many office buildings do you know that get a contamination check every year and get a clean bill of health? You know, surely it is one of the safest buildings to go to. So we have to put it into context, don't we? So that's me. I'll hand over to Ben now to talk about the insurance risk aspect.
Yeah, I know Cromford Mills personally as well, and I'd affirm what you've said, David. What they've done there is it's pretty impressive, really, bearing in mind what they started with. But in respect of the insurance side, you take any signage parked here at your own risk, for example. Prosecutors we're not going to be liable for X, Y, Z. I'm not a lawyer, but I would suggest that signage is there as a deterrent. But ultimately, if you can be liable for trespassers hopping over a fence and just doing whatever they're doing and still be sued, I think the reality is you know, that duty of care and the tort is negligence in respect of that duty of care for public falling over and all the rest of it. So there is always risk. The insurance will cover that risk. But David makes a good point in respect of if it is too risky on the probability matrix, if you like, the insurers will probably agree with that and say, we're not going to provide cover. So it's really a case of, if you want to do it, get your ducks in a row, make sure, put up a good argument of why you're going to do it, how the risk is going to be controlled. And if you've got a quality insurer, they probably will play ball. And then if somebody does fall over and try and sue you because they've broken a leg, for argument's sake, that is ultimately what the insurance is there for.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben and David. We've got,
sorry, Bev, just to add to that, I think the other key thing, which we're just taking as read, but perhaps we shouldn't take it as read, is that you must make sure you've got insurance. And it isn't perhaps as obvious as it sounds because of the complexities, as Ben brilliantly covered in his presentation, about the contract works insurance and the overlap with the building contractor needing a joint policy and such like. It is easily overlooked that if you're organising a public event whilst that contract is running, whose insurance policy is actually covering that? And normally, if the trust is organising the event, it's the trust's policy. So you can't rely on the contractor having insurance to cover that. And you therefore need to make sure you've got cover and to discuss it with your insurer to make sure that they are comfortable, you've carried out the risk assessment, you've got the method statement, and they're happy to take the risk. So yeah, rather than just assuming that we've all understood that, I thought it'd just be worth pointing that out.
That's a really good point. Stephanie, you've got your hand up. What's your question?
Thanks very much. It was actually just a little bit of reflection, and I hadn't really expected to sort of mention this, but it was a really useful conversation about insurance. We completed a community asset transfer for the Arden American Lighthouse complex last year. And at that time, obviously, when we took over ownership, we were looking to obtain insurance. previously it had been owned by the Highland Council and they'd self-insured the site, so there wasn't a kind of precedence in place, as it were. And we really struggled to get the information that we've been discussing today. We got in touch with the Community Ownership Support Service, who weren't really able to advise because we were Grade A listed. And I just thought, I mean, for you guys, it might be worth reaching out, because I think there could be other organisations like us who are struggling to find this information. We only joined the Heritage Trust Network earlier this year, so it's been a great resource since that time, but it would have been handy to have the information a bit earlier. And on the back of that, I mean, the solution that we came up with basically was we managed to find an insurer who was prepared to insure the site. It took quite a long time for us to negotiate an agreement, and during that process we got one of our architects to prepare a sort of outline reinstatement cost document, which I think was used as the basis. But I'm now perhaps a little bit concerned that wasn't really a thorough enough process. I don't know if Ben has any thoughts on that.
Kind of worms there. I would say, if we take a step back, insurers, okay, quality insurers are not led by a computer drop-down box system where it says yes, no, or what have you. Yes, there are versions of that for personal insurance, but put those to one side. For something like Heritage, it's impossible to approach that. What you need to do is liaise with a broker that actually understands what's going on and knows what questions the insurers are going to ask. So someone like ourselves can help with that, basically, to try and source the information as best we can, bearing in mind there could be a scarcity in certain areas. There's also a case of, depending on the scale and the size of what we're talking about, the insurers are not locked in their offices. They are quite transient, and they can come out. And to put it bluntly, it's a cost benefit reward analysis, really. But if there's enough meat on the bone, they can come out and provide their professional guidance before they actually assume the risk, so to speak. Twofold of benefits there. One is that's at no cost, because you haven't signed up to anything at that point. So you're getting that expertise guidance, but they're also seeing it firsthand. And because they know what they're looking for and they've got capabilities in this area, then they can advise upon a lot of the stuff that you might not have thought about as well.
That's great, thanks, Ben. I suppose picking up on what Stephanie said as well, for those who are maybe in the earlier stages of their projects, and some of the information comes a little bit too late, I would just say check our talent bank on the Heritage Trust Network website. Talent bank and toolkit are your friends, I would say, and I don't think they used half as much as they need to be by our members. We're going to have a real big push on trying to get people to use them, because, as Stephanie's just said, some of this information could have been made available much earlier for her. And it's the same, not only for insurance, it's for any sort of stage you're going through with your projects and with your buildings. If there's anything that you're looking for, do get in touch with us, because we're a peer-to-peer network, and one of our members will have been there and done it and can recommend someone. So please do ask, don't wait. Let me just check the questions. I've got one here that says, what are groups often unaware of when it comes to insurance claims? E.g., what do they miss in the small print?
Any advice? If it's one thing that I would recommend as a takeaway message, I suppose, is, and this applies to any insurance policy, there's a reason why they shout about the benefits. The benefits are only as good as you want them to be in respect of your own context. Forget that. Flip to the exclusions and flip to the policy conditions, because that's what the insurer is going to do when you have a claim. So as long as you are happy and understand the exclusions and you understand your obligations through the conditions, then to be honest with you, a claim should be relatively seamless. And when claims are done well, they're done very, very well. I mean, it's never shouted about, but the stats are 96% of all UK insurance claims are paid, and paid swiftly and equitably. The ones where they're not paid are usually down to misunderstandings in respect of what's being insured, and there could be disclosure issues there in respect of the insurer thinking it's something, but it's actually something else, or indeed policy conditions not being complied with. But again, that's where the policy broker comes into play, because we are the professionals. We should be advising our clients, this is what you need to know. Let's not talk about what you don't need to know. Let's talk about what you do need to know. And that way a claim should be relatively straightforward.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'm not sure if this one's very easy to answer at the moment, but we've had a recent burning issue amongst HTN members, which is the rising costs and lack of contractor and materials availability due to Brexit, sorry, B word, and the pandemic. How do you mitigate the risk factor, and how do you factor it into your plans?
Want me to take that one, Ben?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, you can only control what you can control, and those things are outside of your control. So the first thing I would say is don't get stressed about it. By all means, get concerned about things that you have control over. But things like Brexit and inflation and contractor availability, you've just got to deal with it in your risks. So it's a perfect example, really, of why I suggest the risk assessment is an ongoing, regular activity, because things change. Only, 3-4 months ago, none of these were a concern. Now they're a real concern. Who knows what it'll be like in another 3 or 4 months. Hopefully things may have returned back to normal a little bit, but we don't know. It could be worse. Either way, the key really is to keep on top of it, monitor the situation, and to take what actions you can to mitigate. So what sort of things can you do to mitigate at the moment? Well, obviously, it depends on what stage your project is at. If you already have a contractor in place, hopefully, these things are impacting on that contractor, but if you've got the right contract, they're not impacting too much on the trust. If you have not yet got a contractor and you're about to go out to tender, then that's a little bit more scary. If you've already got funding secured, so you're on a fixed budget, if you like, then obviously that's the worst situation to be in. But if you're not yet there, if you haven't yet applied for the funding, then obviously you can put in a higher cost estimate, or certainly you can put in a higher contingency allowance. And that last bit is the key. No matter what stage you're at, you want a healthy contingency to cover those unexpected events that will crop up. They always crop up. Now, we know what they are at the moment, but I talked about a few in my presentation now, things that even though we'd done our risk assessment, there were still things that caught us out. The only way that it didn't derail the project was because we had healthy contingencies. And yeah, that's the key, is keep a monitor on the situation, build in a healthy contingency. And if anyone's got any specific problems at the moment with that worst scenario of having funding already secured and therefore a fixed budget, and your costs are going up, then I'm more than happy to help outside of the meeting. But one thing I would suggest is talk to your funders. You might think this is terrible, the sky is about to fall in, but I can assure you the funders want your project to work just as much as you do. If they've awarded funding, that means they're committed to it. Now, I can't guarantee you they'll be able to do anything about it, but they would certainly want to help if they could. And it's a conversation to have. Don't be afraid to talk to your funders.
That's a brilliant point, David, and do it sooner rather than later, I would say.
Yep.
Stephanie said, go on, David. What's a healthy contingency?
Okay, right. Yeah.
Put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. But I'm not going to answer the question. Well, I am going to answer the question, but I'm going to give a diplomat's answer, which is, well, you ask your quantity surveyor. The key is to have a good, experienced team around you. One thing I always admit to is that I am not an expert in anything. I make sure that the team has all the expertise that the project needs to succeed. So a question like that, I would rely on the quantity surveyor, and I'd make sure that through the procurement process, we've got the right quantity surveyor who comes up with the right answer. Yeah. So sorry, Stephanie, I can't give you an actual number.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. Talking of quantity surveyors and particularly the rising costs issue, if anyone here didn't catch our rising costs webinar from 2 weeks ago, it's now on the website as a recording. It's our web address /videos. We've got a whole library there of recordings of these sorts of events that are there to help you. So do check it out. Oh, David's just put a link in the chat box. That was very quick. Thanks, David. And again, check out Talent Bank if you're looking for someone like a quantity surveyor. We had focus consultants last week speaking at that event, and they were absolutely full of tips and advice. So check it out. I've come to the end of the list of questions, so I don't know if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, or we've only got a few minutes left. So
Bev, I do have one qualification actually. I just made a faux pas, which I should correct really in respect to ecclesiastical and the premises that David were insuring. I was getting my heritage properties modelled up. There was another serious one that they were involved with where they've done a sterling job. So just to clarify that really.
You're forgiven.
Thank you, Ben. That's a relief because I wasn't aware of it. I was only assuming that it must be with a previous ownership of Wentworth Woodhouse. Just a completely different property, that would explain it.
Does anybody have any questions? No? Wow, you've covered everything, David and Ben. That's just brilliant. I can't ask for more than that. So I don't know if either of you have got anything that you want to add or ask any of the attendees here at all, or you've both said that you'll share slides and then you'll share the resilience roadmap. Are you both happy for me to put you in touch with people if they ask to be put in touch with you?
Yeah, you know, I mean, from our perspective, we're happy to speak to any of the membership really about anything insurance and works related or structure related, regardless of whether we represent you or not. It doesn't matter, because we're basically, our ethos is basically to give the industry a better name, to be honest with you. So if we can provide some sort of help in respect of your own journey, then we'll happily have that conversation.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
And likewise, Bev, I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone who would find it useful.
Fabulous.
And my only other plea would be, as you said earlier, is if you have not been to Wentworth Woodhouse or you've not been to Cromford Mills, please go. Both sites need every visitor they can get. And they're both well worth it. I mean, they're fantastic places. They really are. Definitely.
I think we need to have a proper HTN meeting somewhere in one of those venues. It would be fantastic. And talking about membership, if any of you here aren't yet members, do check out our membership page. We've recently restructured our membership packages. So there are various things you can go for, and it starts off with a free Connect membership. So if you feel that your organisation can't afford membership at the moment, don't let that stop you. Go for our Connect membership, and you still get access to some of toolkits, and you still, get free access to these events as well. So please do go and check it out, and our upcoming events too on the website. David's just said, let me see, it's disappeared. Oh, I thought it was a question. Sorry, yes, definitely fascinating places to visit. Oh, brilliant. So if nobody's got any more questions, then I think we'll bring it to a close. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, may I just say, the way that we got involved with the Heritage Trust Network was through the Architectural Heritage Fund. At the moment, if you're doing their project viability grants, they'll actually cover the cost for you, just in case anyone didn't know that.
They are absolutely fantastic. We work really closely with the Architectural Heritage. I think Asher was on this a little bit earlier, one of their officers. So yes, if you do get funding from them, your membership's covered. So it's well worth looking into that. So I think that's it from us. Just left to me to say thank you so much to David and to Ben, both for the fantastic advice and presentations, and to the Heritage Lottery Fund for making this possible as well. Can't forget to thank them. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Bev. Good to see you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.